Good afternoon, and a welcome to everybody today to the event called Building Trust During Scientific Uncertainty, How Do We Better Respond to Outbreaks? This event is co-sponsored by Aspen Institute's Science and Society program and Boston University Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases Policy and Research. I'm Nahid Bedelia. I'm the founding director of CEID, and our mission here at CEID is to improve societal resilience against the threat of emerging and epidemic infectious diseases pathogens worldwide. We do so by focusing on 4 pillars: governance, resilience, innovation, and trust. We call it GRIT. We are a research think tank, a capacity strengthening partner, and our work focuses beyond that in providing legislative support, community outreach, and training. Today's event is part of our core pillar of work around how we build trust to respond to public health emergencies such as outbreaks.
I'm Aaron Mertz, and I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Science and Society program, which is part of our broader health, medicine, and society program. Science and Society was established in 2019 with the mission to democratize science as a guiding force for public good. We work to elevate public trust in science and to help foster a more diverse and more engaged scientific workforce. To do so, we convene experts in solutions-oriented strategy sessions, mobilize a diverse constituency of science advocates, and implement public outreach efforts and initiatives. The program is grateful for general support from Johnson & Johnson, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and the Smart Family Foundation of New York. If we could pull up the slide showing the event format, that would be great. The format for today will be rotating conversations between 2 of our panelists at a time, as illustrated in this image. They will engage with prompt questions and then have a freely flowing conversation for about 12 minutes, at which point I will come on to say that our time is up. Then the first speaker will drop off and will be joined by the next speaker. The pairings continue until speaker 4 and speaker 1 converse. Then we will bring all of the panelists back at the end for a question and answer session fielded from the live chat, the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and questions submitted in advance during registration. For our first paired conversation, Cassandra Pierre will interview Nahid Bedelia. Dr. Cassandra Pierre is assistant professor at the Boston University School of Medicine, medical director of public health programs, and the associate hospital epidemiologist at Boston Medical Center, and the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Council. Her research is focused on infection prevention in vulnerable populations. Dr. Nahid Bedelia is the founding director of Boston University's Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases and Policy Research, CEID, Associate Director of National Emerging Infectious Diseases Laboratories at Boston University. She is an internationally recognized leader in highly communicable and emerging infectious diseases with clinical, field, academic, and policy experience in pandemic preparedness. Thank you both for joining us.
Okay, so could you talk a little bit about the role of scientific uncertainty in response to emerging infectious diseases?
Yeah, Cassandra, you and I have actually both faced this, as infectious diseases physicians and those particularly working in infection control. I think that what we need to sort of think about in terms of information sharing, particularly about emerging infectious diseases outbreaks, is that as we learn about novel pathogens, the knowledge base increases as we respond to an outbreak. And our response to the SARS-CoV-2 infections as well as COVID-19 pandemic are a perfect example of that. Often what you see is that the first 100 patients increase our knowledge about both the disease as well as how to both better take care of them and how we can improve and refine public health policy around it. But that very sort of distinction, right, that building of scientific consensus over time, which is built on existing knowledge about viruses and bacteria, but then can sort of alter, as an outbreak goes on, sometimes leads to difficulties in communicating to the public, particularly as recommendations need to be changed as there is, evolving evidence. The other parts that make it difficult is that with novel pathogens, we often, have to wait until we have diagnostics that can tell us how big a problem is, until we can have therapeutics and vaccines that are evolving and we're sort of assessing both their efficacy and their safety. And so just even the response and the shape of the response changes over the arc of a pandemic. And so there's inherent things, in some ways, there are integral things to sort of responding to novel pathogens that are similar to every other health emergency. When things are fast moving, it's hard to get information out to in an equitable way, in a way that sort of doesn't feed into confusion, that doesn't leave space open for malicious intent potentially to spread disinformation. But novel pathogens in particular are difficult because there is that inherent difference in terms of gathering data as we respond to them.
Just out of curiosity, what is your thought about how knowledge of the scientific process plays out into that, even beyond just thinking about the shape and the arc of the pandemic itself?
Well, the difficult thing is, there are pathogens that we get answers to questions we ask, and what do I mean by that? And I think it might be getting to the heart of what you were asking as well, which is there is that shape, the shape of the response changes, but there are diseases that we've known about for decades, like Ebola virus disease, and we are still learning about basic features, such as, for example, we just discovered that there is, because of better laboratory infrastructure in areas where Ebola virus disease is endemic, we are just discovering that there is a small portion of survivors who may be able to pass on the disease even years after survival. And that's the disease that we've known about for decades, right? This is compared to SARS-CoV-2 that we've only known about for 2 years. And so a lot of times this, attainment of scientific information is limited also by the infrastructure that we have put into place to find the answers. You can't find things you don't look for, and that's where elements of equity, I think, sort of come into play. But also they reveal the importance of why we need to have that capability and infrastructure in different parts of the world for us all as a globe to be prepared. Because our biggest blind spots, I think, are the fact that, we don't pick up these threats, partly because it's just the research capacity, but also at the tail end of a lot of infectious diseases surveillance are communities that don't have access to care. I know half the world doesn't have access to essential healthcare, so that our inquiry stops at that point, if you will.
And just thinking through, we talked about this before, thinking about how we've had to go through multiple iterations. It feels like this is a time where people have had to get degrees in pharmacology and public health and immunology. I do wonder too about the thought that even just, the scientific process itself evolving so rapidly, going down multiple alleys that are sometimes blind, and also feeling like years of research are compressed into 2 weeks. Do we think that, are we expecting too much in terms of what we and how we message about these changing epidemics? Is the way that we message about them, does that need to change?
Yeah, I think that's a couple of things, right? It's what we share and how we create capacity as a society for people to be able to sort of understand elements of scientific uncertainty, and so we've there's more and more statistics about how our investment in public scientific sort of knowledge and basic principles of statistics, as well as public health or infection control, could aid future responses to this. But you're right, inherently there's going to be complicated issues that even those of us who are experts within our field sometimes feel like this is just drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of evidence that's coming out, and that's where I think there's an element of do we trust the people who share the information with us? And which is why I think events like this are important, because it's not just about the knowledge, it's not just about the mode of sharing, but I also do think a bit of that is, can you take somebody else? Whose word are you taking if there's a fast moving emergency and there's a lot of data that's changing? Who is sort of your person, your sort of public health expert or your information source that you trust enough to be able to digest that information? So I do think it's beyond just that scientific uncertainty. I think it has to do with and public knowledge about science and you know, and accept and understanding new concepts that are coming up. But I do think it's sort of also, there's an element of this about how much, where, I guess, how much people trust other sources and where they go to those sources for information.
Thanks, Nikki. I'm going to read a question from the Q&A. I'm trying to communicate with society. Many scientists speak about believing in science, quote unquote. This is a religious statement. It does not help. Trust in science is something totally different. How do the panelists prefer to explain the difference?
Oh, I am so glad you asked that question, because I become uncomfortable when people say trust in science, because exactly as you said, in my mind as a scientist, the process of science is accumulation of data and consensus building. And so almost when you say trust in science, you are pitting it against trust and belief, which, you know, and so those things become equal. That's the distinction, is that science is through gathering of data, through repetition of experiments, coming to the same conclusion, and hence building a consensus around what in that moment is the most likely reflection of the best practices, of the best knowledge that we have available. And so I think when people say, in my mind, when people say trust in science, they're referring to maybe trust in the scientific enterprise, the methodology for us to get better answers, rather than a process that is not based on evidence generation. And I think some part of that also refers to maybe saying trust in the public health leadership of the country, or whoever else they're sort of referring to. They're referring to the bodies themselves who are sharing the information, rather than science, the disciplines, you know, that sort of go into that, building that evidence. I don't know. What do you think, Cassandra? Would you agree with that? Yeah,
I would agree. I would say science is not a book that has been written. Yeah. It's not the Bible. The other thing too, when I hear trust in science, even though, you know, I feel like, you know, we follow the scientific process, we follow the evidence where it leads us, and I do believe in that. I think for many people, trust in science also conjures up this very negative connotation, thinking about what has been done to get that science, thinking about you know, what it's meant to practice evidence-based medicine. There are a lot of people who have had to suffer for that purpose. We know historically, globally, when we think about different, you know how we've come up with our current obstetric science, what we've done to figure out about thresholds of pain. Many people have had to suffer for that. We have sometimes our practices are built on marginalization and trauma inflicted on others. So I think for other people too, science, sure, could be another false god, but it could also be somewhat sinister when you think about it that way. So
yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, that's true. And the other part of trust in science that makes me uncomfortable is that there are, you know, definitely elements of the scientific institutions currently that are still not equitable. You know, not all researchers' voices or questions are represented, you know, or funded in the same way. We talk about trying to introduce diversity of voices and diversity of backgrounds in NIH-funded researchers, and you know, ensuring that there is diversity of workforce in the scientific sort of you know, inquiry group, and so science institutions tend to fail. But I think when people, you know, to me, trust in science at least refers not to trust blindly all information that scientists give you. It's to trust in the process, that when a consensus has happened and evidence base has been created, that the data in front of us, which is now supported by many different sources, is a better path forward compared to one that's based simply on belief, I suppose.
I agree. I would love to delve more into that, but I know we don't have much time left, and I wanted to get through one last one. So how do we, how do we correct for minimize the import of politics on building scientific consensus? From a discourse in both high and low resource settings, the political decisions and the implications thereof sound louder than the science.
Yeah, and Dr. Ayabare, who's asking this question, you know, he and I have, thank you for that question. He's a researcher based in Uganda, you know, and this is a perfect question of the diseases that get studied are diseases that are important to those who have the resources to fund that research, right? And we try to sort of, there is, you know, tons of organizations, NIH, others have tried to work on increasing training capacity in other countries. We've tried to sort of, you know, but there isn't equity in terms of what Dr. Ivor is talking about, which is having people from different economic backgrounds and research settings also setting the research agenda. And that's wherein I think it also is limited. It's the sin of omission of that viewpoint of that trust in science. But then if science is only concentrating on answers that are important to a certain group of people, is science representative of the answers that we could have, is that process, not so much science, but is the process representative of equity? I think the difference, though, is that for the general public who's listening, I think the big thing is, as you're looking through this, the way that I sort of try to answer to figure out what the best data on something is to see if multiple sources of data have shown the same thing. And if a scientific opinion is developed, if you see that 99% of the people in science, public health experts, scientists, physicians are in one potential camp, and you have a very small minority in another, that's also a hint that majority of the people are looking at the same data and coming to a result that might be a path that potentially may reflect the body of the current knowledge. So I know we're running out of time as well. So I'm going to actually turn, Cassandra, thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Lee Mcintyre, who I think is the next person on there. Yep.
Thank you, Cassandra. We're going to bring Lee Mcintyre on now. And Dr. Mcintyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, and the author of the books Post-Truth, The Scientific Attitude, and How to Talk to a Science Denier. And Dr. Vidalia will interview him now.
Dr. Mcintyre, I am so excited to have you in this conversation because, I'm hoping that you'll help me both as a physician who's answering questions and patients in my offices, but also to help others who might be listening and who have similar questions, and really the prompt is, how do we take all these inherent challenges that Dr. Pierre and I talked about and strike this healthy balance between skepticism of new data and then getting enough consensus to have a meaningful action, particularly when you have a fast-moving public health emergency like a pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. It's my honor to be here and to speak with you all. Look, scientists deal with that balance all the time. Scientists are skeptical. They have questions, they have doubts, but they overcome those doubts through gathering evidence. And then when the doubts are answered, then scientific consensus can come forward, but always with the proviso that you can then change your mind again based on future evidence. I mean, that's what I wrote about in the scientific attitude. I think that's just how science works. So I think that the challenge is not for how scientists balance skepticism and consensus, because you all do that pretty well. The problem is the public perception of that process, because I think that the public doesn't really understand how science works. And so when uncertainty gets played out in public, especially when it's life and death stakes and it's happening really fast for something like a pandemic, people get confused. Because I think that most people, even people who trust in science, think that science is about proof. But science is not about proof. Science is about likelihood given the evidence. And so if people think that it's about proof and then you change your mind, then there's trouble.
So how do we, I completely agree with you. I think that the maybe some of the distrust that public has in the scientific enterprise, comes from that changing data. How do we, as public health practitioners or public health organizations, how do we communicate when the data is changing so quickly? What would be a better way for us to talk about what the current state of data is without, it's so interesting. You and I just were talking before the event about the communicating these types of complex ideas within 2.5 minutes, on media spots. You can't do it. So how do we communicate about a particular life or death situation, and which also has uncertainty, but maybe not so much uncertainty that,
right,
nothing is known, just enough uncertainty that we may not know the granular details or something.
So, and how do you share that? How do you communicate that in the appropriate way? I mean, you put your finger on exactly the thing. It's the, the topic we're all talking about today. It's this, this question of trust, because I think that the way to address it is to lean into the idea of uncertainty. Don't be afraid to communicate uncertainty. I mean, scientists and physicians, you're not afraid of uncertainty. You deal with it all the time and you understand it. But somehow when the hot lights are on and people are criticizing, it's very tempting even for scientists to overstate and claim that something is proven when it's not. And that's deadly, because then when people change their mind, the public's reaction is, oh, so were you lying before or are you lying now? But that's simply how science works. So my best advice is that scientists who have the right values about this, I mean, they are changing their mind on the basis of evidence. What else would you have them do? I think that the best thing is to lean into it, embrace uncertainty, explain why it's important to change your mind on the basis of evidence. And I think the other thing that's, again, hard to do when we're getting criticized, publicly and worse sometimes, is to express the humility that scientists have, the humility to be able to change your mind on the basis of evidence, to be able to say, we thought this was true, and it turned out not to be true. And, to me, what happens is the public has questions. And I think that they don't quite understand that scientists have questions too. But scientists' response to those questions is, let's go to the data, let's do some experiments, and let's figure this out. And at the end of that process, I think it's important to express not just what you found, but how you found it, the road that you took to get there. So, I'm thinking of a focus group that the GOP pollster Frank Luntz had to try to find just the right message on COVID. The winning message was, and I forget the name of the fellow, but he somebody who was he was an epidemiologist, a scientist, who was so humble. And, he said, basically, look, we don't know everything, but here's what we do know. And here's why we think that we know that based on the data. And here's what we still don't know and what we'd like to learn, but here's what we're doing about that. So it was kind of the attitude that he used, just the attitude of embracing uncertainty, expressing humility. I think that, again, that's hard to do in an environment in which you just feel like you're giving ammunition to somebody to attack you. But what I found in my own research, talking to science deniers, which is what I did in preparation for my book, is that humility, embracing uncertainty, actually increases trust, because it humanizes you in an environment in which you're being attacked, as liars, all the disinformation, and it humanizes you, and it shows that you're trustworthy people, which you are.
So question for you, Lee, and I think, you and Clint will be talking about this in a little bit anyway, but here's my dilemma is not to, for anybody who's probably heard me speak about this, I often go into the weeds more often than they would like me to, because that's the professor in me. But this idea that, it's not so much, but those are great lessons. It's not so much that it's this worry that if, are we, after you present all that stuff, what I've found is that people are asking me, well, then what do you want me to do? What is the answer? And generally it's following up with a course of action. And what's difficult, right, as a science communicator, as a scientist in this environment, is that if I present all this stuff, which a lot of times I don't even get a chance to do in the venues that I may speak about them. But then if I get to this, and hence on this data, I recommend you do this. What's happening is that there actors, there are disinformation, misinformation agents who are basically saying, well, look, you can't be certain of the recommendation this person just made. They themselves admitted that they have no certainty around this. Rather than saying there's some uncertainty, there's like extremism, there's a black and white, and that's a hard thing to sort of navigate as someone who's trying to get public health, activities on the ground happening to protect populations. So how do we balance that?
It's a very tough question, because it's a tough issue to do. Because you're not only trying to convince people who might be confused, you're trying to convince people who are confused because they're being lied to by someone else. People who are telling them that they shouldn't trust a word out of your mouth. And so you're not only communicating information, you're trying to get them to trust you at the same time. And so it is it is very difficult to get that right. I think that, I mean, some people do just want to be told what to do. They want to know what's the conclusion. To me, the amazing thing about science, the reason that it's so successful as it is not because it can offer proof or certainty, but because it offers probability and likelihood based on the evidence. So even to express things in terms of probability helps. The example that I think of here is, the person who always says, well, can you prove to me that climate change is real? You don't even have 100% consensus amongst the scientists. So, maybe I'm right. Well, then you read that Reuters just reported that confidence interval for anthropogenic climate change is 5 sigma, which is 1,000,000 to 1. Well, that's pretty good probability. So if you present it as it's proven, and then the person comes back with, oh, no, it's not, and they can name some scientist who disagrees, then you're on the defensive. But if you present it with, well, we're not 100% certain, but it's 1,000,000 to 1, that makes it a little clearer. And I think that sometimes it's funny sometimes because I love watching the epidemiologists and the public health officials because they're so scrupulous and trying so hard to do the right thing. But sometimes the explanations make it difficult for the public to, as you said, to hear what they need to know. And sometimes that message is, it's overwhelmingly likely, more likely that you're going to get sicker if you have COVID than if you have the vaccine. Yes, it's possible for there to be vaccine injury, but it's so exceedingly rare that if you compare the two, this is what's most likely to happen. And I mean, people do that. Sometimes other people don't listen, but I always get nervous when I hear language around proof and certainty, and I get happier when I hear scientists expressing language around probability and likelihood, because that removes that moment when you have to say, whoops, we changed our mind.
There's some interesting questions from a couple of attendees that I'm going to try to roll into one, because I think they go into the same theme. So one is this idea of, how do we, which I think we at CEID and also Aspen are trying to do, which is this idea of imparting and sharing, as you said, both the process, but I think that what we need to do is potentially also see ourselves as, as ambassadors of, well, and this is what we mean when we say probability, this is what it means, this idea of addressing maybe lower literacy around those concepts in the general public, while we're also sharing the information. We should see that potentially as something that we do as a part of how we explain the method. So that's one part. There's a question about how we sort of, look to address through media and others on adults who may not have literacy in those issues. But the other question, which I thought was important, was it seems to me a false dichotomy that there is such an us versus them of scientists versus experts, public, and who knows the science based on argument of leaning into uncertainty. How can we recognize the knowledge of the lived experience along with the knowledge of the scientific process? So one thing I will discern that is that there is when we say lived experience, I think that there is this struggle, because science does need to be humble to be able to hear the signal from the noise. And long COVID, for example, is a good example of many patients coming out and saying, there's a phenomenon, listen to us, there's something going on. And then, scientists sort of working to try to understand that. But then that's different, right? I mean, when we talk about the lived experience, Lee, how do we discern between that idea that science needs to listen to, well, my one anecdote is the same as your 3 million people, there's side effects database for vaccine. How do we sort of make that balance between the two?
Again, it's hard because you want to listen to people because it's the humane thing to do, but also because sometimes they can tell you things that are also data that, even if it hasn't been in a controlled experiment, you hear the same thing from people over and over, and you have to take it seriously. I just think in general that the more people feel heard, the more they build trust. And when trust is destroyed, when people, when the experts say, I'm an expert, do what I say because I'm the expert and you're not. So, I mean, even if you're right, and even if they would in other circumstances do that, that's the wrong thing to say. Now, very few people say it that way, or even, even come close to putting it that way. But I think that there's also the fact that those sorts of pronouncements are kind of made with a megaphone. So even when Dr. Fauci's being as careful as he can possibly be, it sounds to people like, he's telling them what to do, and they get angry about it. So it's hard. I mean, my work is to increase literacy of how science actually works, because I think that if more people understood how science works, there would be fewer problems like this. And I think that most science denial happens because people don't know scientists. I think that if more people had actually met scientists, they would trust scientists more. It's when they're getting the disinformation and they don't have anybody that they trust who's a scientist to check in with, then they're lost.
That might be a good transition to the next conversation.
Thank you. Now we'll bring on Clint Watts. He is a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and non-resident fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's also president of Mibaro Solutions and the author of Messing with the Enemy: Surviving in a World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News. And Dr. Mcintyre will interview him now.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be able to interview you, because as I told you before the event started, I see you on MSNBC and you scare the hell out of me every time, because you seem to know so much about misinformation and disinformation, which I think is a key to this. So my first question to you is, misinformation and disinformation are changing the environment and ability for the general public to get reliable data in an outbreak or a health crisis. How do you see this evolving? How much do you think that these sorts of factors have determined the course of the pandemic?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for that question. It is, I'll summarize and over summarize to a degree the challenge, which is you will routinely hear people argue it's because of social media we're in this problem. You've even heard President Biden mention Facebook in particular at times, but that's not entirely fair. It is part of the problem. And it's also one that's not going back into the genie's not going back to the bottle. We're not going to get rid of social media. So that's one part of it. So it's one part, the algorithm, but the other part of it is us. And we oftentimes don't evaluate internally how people receive information. And it's been interesting having worked in the military and out of the military and overseas and here during the war on terror and more recently on election influence and now COVID, is that the human mind was not meant to see and evaluate 5 hours of social media content a day. So at no point in human history has there been this burden where you have to take in so much of information and so quickly and then rapidly assess all that information and make a decision about whether to share it and be correct 100% of the time. And you've got an algorithm that helps deliver that. That's an impossible expectation. We can't expect people to bat 1,000. They don't in normal conversations, but there's a different dynamic, right? If we were to go into a group at work or school or with family or at a religious setting, we might say something and people would say, I don't think that's correct because, I was there and that's not what happened. And you would change your opinion. There is a hurdle that happens in the social media world that's easily passed over, that's much more difficult, and that's called rebuttal. Now, there's several things about it. Social media is designed to give you content that you like from people that look like you and talk like you anytime you want. So that's confirmation bias, implicit bias, availability bias. You add all those three together, that's an information Death Star, as if we want to use a Star Wars reference, right? And so how do we manage that? Well, we can help people be better, and we can help the companies and social media companies, the information environment be better. It's really a multi-part solution. It has absolutely been worse this time around because of the speed at which information moved, and that the messenger today, as opposed to 1985, I like to say, Dr. Fauci was around in 1985. When he would go to a podium, he would communicate out, and that would be communicated out through the news, and it would be evaluated, but that would be it. Today, everyone is their own messenger. Everyone's their own printing press. And so it's a volume problem that it's going to be really challenging for us to ever overcome, but we can improve the system collectively if we understand how information moves.
How? What would be maybe the most important thing that we could do to be proactive against this kind of threat that you're talking about?
So I think you made an important distinction at the start, which is misinformation versus
Yes.
disinformation. So that oftentimes isn't understood. Misinformation is incorrect or false information that's shared by people without them knowing or understanding that it's false. What I tend to call crazy uncle emails we used to get at a slower pace. 10 years ago, we used to always joke that we have a family member, right, that shares something with us, and people would take a Snopes or a fact rebuttal, right, and they would push back on them, but it still was like a small problem. Now with Facebook, that's on steroids. So that's one part of the problem. Separately though, it's disinformation. These are people that deliberately push out false information with an intended objective to deceive an individual or an audience for some specific purpose. That is much more dangerous because very effective disinformation creates a cascading effect with highly algorithmic explosive misinformation, to where the two in combination have an escalating effect. And we saw that during what we call the infodemic with the pandemic, which was when you are scared, when you're angry, you tend to believe information soon thereafter that may be false, and you're more likely to because you have a physiological reaction to that information. It's a survival instinct. So you might remember there were crazed text message about the National Guard being deployed around the country and lockdowns, and that created price surging and runs on materials and all sorts of things, right? All of those amplifying effects, in addition to the health problems, really show the power of disinformation, which is whoever can move quick and be voluminous in their messaging and be in a closed environment in terms of their messaging and not be rebutted in a timely fashion,
Right.
which is very difficult for exports. If you are fast, most trusted source, no rebuttal, you can really cause damage to a society. And I think we see that both with COVID-19 response and with vaccines. The burden placed on doctors and medical experts has been enormous to write the truth. So a couple things. One is algorithmic testing and being aware on the disinformation front of what you would call the top 1% of disinformation peddlers. If you know who they are, don't try and police everything. We did this in crime and terrorism and other things. Just focus on those that are putting out the most and most prolifically. Separately, then, can you use the algorithms to advance truth against those by creating the rebuttal? And you're seeing a lot of the companies do that now. They will put up links. It doesn't solve the problem alone. There's no silver bullet, but we're starting to identify technological, algorithmic ways that we can start to advance the truth against falsehoods. And I think that's a really positive sign. It's been too late, but at least we're moving in the right direction.
I like that idea very much, because the disinformation question, I think, has been vastly underestimated with COVID. People don't realize that quite a bit of the disinformation, making its way out, that becomes misinformation because people are passing it along unwittingly, has been from Russian intelligence. It has, they are deliberately putting stories in, like that one in the Oriental Review in April 2020 about the microchips in the vaccines. People don't realize that story was created by Russian intelligence, put forward in their English language arm, and then taken up very quickly. I mean, within a month, 44% of Republicans and something like 25% of the American people thought that was true. So I like very much the idea about focusing not just on the information, but on who's making the disinformation, getting to that top 1%, as you say. But of course, you can't get the disinformers to stop creating disinformation. Right. So what's the pinch point? What do you just deplatform them? Do you identify them? I remember that study from the Center for Countering Digital Hate that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. Do you identify those people and just deplatform them? Is that sufficient, or is there some other way to cut the head off of the disinformation?
So that's the number one action you can take, which is focus on the most prolific and raise the cost for them to create that content on such scale. I think that's the first thing. Okay. And so the second part, I think, is also understanding what the objectives are, because different objectives lead to different disinformation peddlers. Fake cures is its own business and industry. And so if you want to battle that, that's a criminal model, right, that you need to pursue. There's litigation, there's law enforcement actions that you can take. That might be a more successful way to keep free speech going, which we do want, but also pursue different kinds of peddlers. At the nation state level, it definitely is deplatforming. And so I can tell you 3 areas in particular. The one you mentioned, Oriental Review, about microchips, 5G technology, and in terms of a bioweapon. All 3 of those narratives were prolifically advanced by Russian disinformation and amplified or just duplicated by China and some other actors. And so in those cases, it is literally going after them and trying to squelch their ability to produce. It gets more difficult in the social political context. And that's where it gets really dicey, because we're constantly battling the, how do we maintain a free and open environment for information, which is very much about our democracy, with how do we also keep people from being harmed, right? So one of my big things that I push for academia right now is, can you focus on measuring public harms from false information? I would love, only really research institutes and universities can do that. My team is mostly hunting, actors that are doing this or trying to help algorithms be improved, but it's very difficult to do when you can't measure the harm. So what is yelling fire in a movie theater and social media? What is that equivalent? I think with vaccines, that case can be made pretty easily. Like, this has been very damaging in terms of our uptake of vaccines, which has led to deaths. You can see it in certain places, or in terms of COVID cases and response in other places. So I'm hoping we can get to that, where we can make better and informed regulatory and legislative decisions around what should be policed in social media. And that way, I think we can collectively make that judgment that a democracy should make.
So it's, I mean, really what you're saying is that it's an information war. It's not just, this is not happening by accident. This is not just, something that somebody woke up one day and wondered if there were microchips in their vaccines. This is being pushed, sometimes for political or ideological reasons, sometimes for financial reasons, in the case of the false cures and things. And that I like what you said there, that in some cases we can go after the criminal model, but I'm intrigued, especially with all the military paraphernalia on the wall there. How does when the US military is in an information war, are there tools that they use that we could use domestically, but for our social, political, cultural hesitancy to do it? That is, I'm just wondering if there are things that we could be doing that we're not doing, that we could take a page from how information war works in the military.
So I do believe there are some principles. The military, at least the US military, is not very good at information warfare, to be honest. They have a lot more limitations than the authoritarians they go against. Speaking truth, authorities influencing only foreign audiences, the mechanisms by which they do things, all much tougher. But I think there are some important principles that can be learned. Vis-a-vis the way we've come to adjust our institutions to communicate as if it's 1985, and we keep trying to do that. So one would be, you got to say something. So the US government, as an institution, when they say something, they tend to be slow, they tend to be very rigid, and they try and go through a set number of messengers. In today's social media environment, if I was looking at it from a military information warfare kind of perspective, we would need a massive increase in the number of messengers and trusted messengers that speak a lot, number one. Two, look like and talk like the target audience. And I've actually worked on some programs in the US that have taken this, which is like, we don't need a press conference. What we need is a social media influence person at a local level that can speak that trusted source, like you talked about during your segment, to the local population in a way that you are in the local environment, but do it in 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be a major press conference. Separately, we just have to have more messages. And I always use the joke in a military audience, which is, on what day did Coke and Pepsi stop advertising? And you'll see this sort of blank stare. And I say they never did, because the moment you stop messaging, you start losing. It is literally an availability bias sort of phenomenon. So I think just getting the message out there more, and that we can't just think the truth is going to take off virally. Like, you have to keep repeating over and over again. And I think we've gotten better as the pandemic has gone on with that respect.
I could talk forever, but we've run out of time. On to the next pairing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to bring Dr. Pierre back to be interviewed by Clint Watts.
Dr. Pierre, I'm thrilled to be on a panel and be the only non-doctor because I get to listen to all the people that are much smarter than me. And so thanks for giving me a chance to interview you. I have, over the last 2 years, done a lot of tracking of misinformation and disinformation, but at the same point, there are valid concerns in the audiences that we communicate with about how you can trust or bridge over time decades of disenfranchisement of certain communities in terms of the information they hear and how they have been treated by the medical system. In particular with African American communities, the track record is not good, in the United States in some places. And there are valid reasons to not necessarily trust the medical community or trust the information they get. What have you seen over the last couple of years in terms of how do we build bridges to restore trust to some of these communities that, have good reason to be skeptical oftentimes in terms of the information that they hear?
Thanks, Cliff, for that question. I appreciate it. I also appreciated learning other diseases in which this information has played a role. But I would say, actually just to pick up where you left off, I think that one of the things that has been clear is that we do need volume of information and messages. We need to outcompete in terms of what people are hearing. But there's a couple of other things. One is, who is delivering messaging? Who are they? We know that just as in health, who is delivering the message, who has a stake in the health of the community, who looks like the people that are being served, plays a really important role in rooting and centering messages and gaining acceptance. And so if the people that are doing the messaging, whether they be public health officials, scientists, doctors, or local leaders, have an invested interest or part of that community, let that community speak the same language, but also treat the community with respect, treat that population with respect, listens to them, understands the barriers, and has shared consequences from outcomes. That is a powerful and beneficial thing. That who is also, it also extends over to the where people are getting their messaging. So we know that public health medical systems have not been doing a great job of diversification and dissemination of information. So in addition to thinking about volume, we also need to think about where we're putting our messaging. So sure, we should and can do print media, we can do TV, we can do conventional radio, but we should also be doing satellite and also advertising on the Haitian radio station that my grandfather used to listen to, and so many other, and social media, of course, and so many other platforms that we can think of and haven't yet. Sometimes I think jokingly of, maybe there should be a news hour on the multiplayer video game platform sometimes, but there are lots of other places that we can think of and should think of to do this. Invoking and having trusted messengers that are community leaders, I've mentioned that in passing, is just going to be really important, I think, on an ongoing basis, if we've learned anything from this pandemic. So those who are community activists, religious leaders, people who may play a role in civic organizations and are noted and recognized as being linchpins in communities, do need to be courted, engaged, and again, treated with respect. Because as we build trust, as we are public health institutions, we do need a little bit of a shorthand. And many institutions have relied on these community organizations and leaders who have really delivered in terms of doing a lot of the work already in translating information, messages, delivering goods like PPE to their communities at a time where there was a vacuum that public health and medicine may not have been filling. So those are some of the things I think of.
So throughout the last couple of years, I'm sure you've seen lots of different messages and messengers, and looking at vulnerable communities that are out there. Is there anything in particular that you would recommend to someone as a messenger? You're a doctor, you've been in this field, but you've also watched others message. Any tips or pointers that you would offer to people when they're thinking about how to engage, at a local level or with a vulnerable community that is right to have some skepticism, but at the same point desperately needs some of these interventions?
So I think it's really important to understand the context and the history of the community that you're speaking to. I think a lot of our structurally marginalized communities, whether it be Black or Brown or experiencing homelessness, have experienced trauma in the setting of medical care, public health, or just in the system in general. And so, thinking about Black and Brown communities, the toll of systemic racism is not just an artifact of the Tuskegee experiments or other remote historical traumas. They are being enacted today. People are experiencing systemic racism in many different spaces in the medical community. And so we do need to address that, I think. I think it's important to say, we know that that you have experienced trauma, that you have earned distrust. And there are concerns about, the intent and the messaging. So I think just acknowledging that, and thinking through the longer process, eventually, hopefully, of truth and also reconciliation, acknowledging what has happened in these communities, to these communities, and currently going on in these communities to ensure people understand that there is acknowledgement of that. But at least acknowledging that history and that understanding is important. And I think, again, making sure that the tone is appropriate, not paternalistic, and more collaborative in terms of thinking through, what are the barriers? What are you seeing? What are your concerns? While shaping and responding to that, and crafting a message. This is not the time to say, we know best. This is what you need to do. As you say, there's earned distrust for the messaging, the message. Again, when we talk about the first discussion, trust the science, many people have had or experienced or have, their in their mind that the science has actually been a malevolent force potentially in their history or their lives. And so it needs to be a situation where we are actively engaging with our community, again, potentially with messengers that represent that community and with trusted leaders who already are committed and have a stake in that community as well. The other thing I guess I would say is that we know that the communities that have, for this pandemic, borne the brunt of death, hospitalization, infections, and probably, unless things change, will continue to bear the brunt of infectious or evolving infections. It's no mistake that these are communities that are experiencing this. We know that there are lots of structural and societal impediments, barriers that have been placed by, what we think of redlining in terms of taking away ability to improve housing, causing multi-generational housing in situations where there's lack of access to healthcare, transportation, quality jobs, and food security. So we knew that these were going to be areas where people were going to experience poor health outcomes and currently experience chronic toxic stress and have underlying health conditions that put them at risk for poor health outcomes. So thinking through partnership with the community doesn't just mean thinking about prevention, the therapeutics that we can offer, the messaging. It also means enabling people to access those things at a very basic level, right? So when we think about our messaging for isolation and quarantine for people who are infected or exposed to COVID-19, there wasn't a lot of conversation about how that would work for people who lived in multi-generational households where or families that shared a studio apartment. What are the resources that can be put in place to support that isolation and quarantine? How will you get masks to people if they lack digital access to buy them online and are not finding them in their local stores? How will you get people to mass vaccination sites in areas that they're unfamiliar with and have no idea how to get to in the transportation? So I think there's a couple of things to think of at the very basic level. But the other thing is, in terms of maybe partnership plus, is thinking through removing some of those barriers in general that lead to those poor health outcomes and thinking about equitable access and outcomes. And that's a much longer process, but I'll end there for now.
Okay. Well, I have one more question as we kind of wrap up, which was, in terms of vulnerable communities that we're trying to treat, but also a community that's become vulnerable more and more in terms of messaging, which is you, doctors, and medical professionals. It's been remarkable for me. I've had the opportunity to go on MSNBC, and it used to be we went in person. It was usually a lawyer and some national security people, right? And doctors have taken over a role in terms of messaging across the country, local doctors, local medical officials. What is it we can provide or create a structural system for to help them be better at it? It's not easy to be a local messenger, out into society and other communities. I've seen a lot of changes over the last year and a half to 2 years, but any big takeaways for you as a medical professional in terms of how you've had to become a communicator? How do you think about communicating, and are there ways we can do better to help support you as well?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, as you say, it's been kind of whirlwind. We're still balancing clinic, and a lot of our other responsibilities have come back in this time period.
Right.
Even though we cleared the decks initially just to focus on COVID. And so even though the rate of advances in information is a bit slower, we still, I think there are some times where we don't have necessarily information that might help support what we're recommending. So I think about the disinformation that you talked about, for example.
Right.
And I think, it's hard to really be whack-a-mole to think about every rumor or myth or disinformation campaign and thinking about tracing it back to its source. But I think sometimes it's helpful just to be aware of what's in the community, what people are hearing, what the concerns are that are being circulated on social media. Because sometimes when people come up to you and say, hey, I heard they were magnets, it's helpful just to be
Right.
prepared for those kinds of things that might occur. And I think just in terms of media, I think actually it's the space and opportunity to think more locally. I think, to be honest, a lot of the things that we're talking about for disinformation and misinformation, as we talk about volume, I also think about proximity. And I think having people in the community who are practicing in your community, who are invested in care, allowing for opportunities to speak in a more broad format on a local level, I think continue to be helpful. And that's actually, I think, where I feel a little bit more comfortable at this point, speaking to the community that I know that that has barriers that I can anticipate, resources that I can connect to.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to bring back all of our panelists now for a group Q&A based on the questions that we've been receiving. There have been some excellent ones. Okay, so first question. How can we override opinions that were fixed early on, especially at the time it was based on the best available information? Basically, what happens when people are done listening after they hear a certain guideline or recommendation? Anyone just chime in?
Yeah, masking would be a perfect example, right? I mean, that's the very beginning. For those who are listening who may not have followed the ins and outs of the infection control data on this, the reason why you saw a huge difference in change in recommendation is because all of a sudden it was recognized that this disease could be transmitted when you don't have symptoms. So it's not like you could just know you have symptoms and that's when it will be transmitting, so you can just advise people to stay home. You actually had to advise people to protect themselves and others against this transmission, even when they themselves may not know that they had an infection. And so that was the change. The other was that I think that there was a lot of, we weren't ready. We weren't pandemic ready. There weren't enough masks. And at the very beginning, there definitely was a struggle of how many masks you had for healthcare workers to respond, because I know this was a struggle everywhere across the country. And that goes back to why we need to be ready so we don't get into this position where you have to choose between populations, right? And then it changed, but and the way, at least for me, the way that I've sort of approached that difference has changed is to talk about what changed, to explain what changed in science. What has worked against me as a physician, as a scientist talking about this, is that there are actually external forces that would say, it was not nuanced, as someone else mentioned, I think, in conversation, where, again, this idea that evidence could change, and based on that evidence, you could change your mind, because there were external forces that were like, well, this person lied. How can you ever listen to them about anything else, right? And there were external forces that were muting my ability to say, well, look, this is what changed, and this is why the policy changed. I don't know if others had thoughts on that.
Part of it, I mean, look, we've all got a cognitive bias to believe the truth of the first thing that we hear. And, this is why misinformation and disinformation are so terrible, because once a lie gets out there, there's a certain percentage of the population that is simply going to believe it, even once it's debunked. But the good news is that there was a study in Nature Human Behavior in June 2019, which provided the first empirical evidence to show that you could debunk, you could overcome the bad information There were several different techniques that they used, and I encourage people to read the study by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid. It was really a path-breaking study. But I mean, so Dr. Bedelia, one of the things that you said there that sounds so important with masks is not just to change the recommendation, but to tell people why. Because if it's simply just changing what they hear, then people fall into that, oh, one time they told me eggs were good, then they say eggs are bad, or, I can't drink coffee anymore, and they just think, well, they're just making it up. But once you pair that with, here's what we learned in the meantime, and here's why we changed our recommendation, I think that goes a lot farther toward convincing people.
Great.
Aaron, can I just offer
Sure.
one trick that they use in the intelligence community? So in the government space, this is a pretty common thing that an intelligence analyst or a law enforcement officer is very certain about their conviction of what happened or what's going to happen. And so there's always a situation where this arises. And so the first thing is to challenge them as to whether they're an open-minded person. So they'll almost always say yes. And you say, are you an open-minded person? They say, of course I am. And say, okay, under what circumstances would you change your opinion about mask or the vaccine? Because that's telling you what you need to deliver to them to start to shape their perceptions. And our general rule, at least in the government space, if you can't identify under what conditions you would change your mind, then you're not an open-minded person, and you're also not going to move. So don't waste your time trying to convince, somebody. Usually, I would say the majority of people would say, well, if I saw the following, or if I did the following, or if so-and-so told me the following, that'll provide a pathway for you to provide information in that way. And I think at the beginning, we were talking about effective communicators. That's kind of what effective communicators do when you watch them over time in terms of disarming, any sort of resistance.
I would say that personally, I've used that technique for patients in thinking about vaccines. So what would change your mind? And then, they said, for example, FDA approval, I wrote a note on the chart and went back to them and said, hey, how are you feeling about this? Now, I would also say, even though this is more a longer term, I also think media and medical or health science literacy is also a really important component of that, even though it's obviously a longer term strategy here. But when we think about what we've been talking about, what people are consuming in terms of media, the conspiracy theories that exist outside of just medicine or this pandemic, there is definitely a great need for media training and thinking about resiliency in consuming messages. So, really starting pretty far upstream in terms of thinking about this.
Following up on the media, we have a few panelists who have very large social media presences and also who appear regularly on television. How do you convey scientific nuance and uncertainty in a very limited character count or a very short few second soundbite on television?
Well, actually, both Cassandra and I and Clint probably can answer this a little bit. I do want to say one thing that I want to mention. Somebody else said this a couple of times in the comments, which is to the prior question, people have to be willing to listen to further explanations and once data changes. And we have to take the elephant in the room, which is that part of the reason further messaging stopped being effective, we scientists, public health folks stopped potentially being effective, is that the whole thing took such a political turn. And not only that, but entire categories or people were just painted with one brush. They're all, if they believe this, they must be blue. If they believe this, they must be red. It became this like a la carte belief menu. If you belong to this party, this is what you believe in. If you belong to this party, rather than what we've been talking about, which is that you can change your mind over time, as most, as we see with science. So to the question that was just asked, it's really hard. I think that I hope I do what part of what Lee said, which was that when I speak, I don't speak in absolutes because we don't know. Instead, I speak in probabilities, which is, it is most likely, it is incredibly unlikely, it is exceedingly rare, rather than saying, is this the truth? Because we can't, at any one point, if the data is changing, in science, there is always a small 0.000.1, like 0.001% chance that something may change. And we as scientists never want to speak in extremes. The other is if I change my mind, within that short period of time, or I'm sorry, if science changes within that short period of time, I try to focus in on that particular message rather than trying to convey everything in every single appearance. I try to focus on what is the critical piece of information. I don't need to say masking every single time, even I do end up saying that. But today I want to focus on this particular thing because it's going to lead to confusion. And so choosing messages at a time based on what's going on is the other thing that I've had to do because of that short character limit or that short sort of period of time on media. But I'd love to hear what others think.
I definitely
I'm not a doctor, so let Cassandra go on this one for sure.
I can be short, but I definitely don't have a large social media. I don't kind of hide. I already have enough time to procrastinate, so I don't do that. It would be difficult to manage. But in the media, I actually second what you were talking about in terms of choosing messages, Nikki. I view myself as part of a chorus. And so what I think about is what is the message that I haven't been hearing that is important to hear, that we need to prioritize, because I know that they're getting great information from Dr. Bedelia and other colleagues that I have. And so I really want to focus on what I think that I haven't been hearing to save that for that time point. But yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And, it always feels bad when someone is like prompting you off the show. But yes, I think that, the message I haven't been hearing is the one that I usually try to uplift.
Great. Next question brought up how distrust can arise when different cities, towns, counties, and states have vastly different guidelines. How can we overcome that? How detrimental is that to trust, especially in as large and fragmented country as the United States?
I can speak to that one a little bit, just having watched the response in other countries. And this goes for something else I work on, which is elections, trust in elections. We have a similar dynamic where every state kind of runs its own elections in different ways. And so it's not quite clear what the process is or the outcomes or why judgments are rendered. The answer in short is it's almost impossible to make people feel sure when everyone's making a different decision at a local level. And really, I think federalism has many strengths in terms of national responses to national things. It's painfully difficult to execute in a unified way with information. I think you see this with other countries, particularly in Europe, where not only do they kind of have a homogeneous citizenry, they have a government that is much smaller, it's much more easy to manage. And oftentimes people will point and say the US should do it like them. And I'm like, yeah, all 12 people versus our 300 million people or 400 million, it's much different in terms of scale. And we had much different phenomenon, right? New York City, just population density is a dramatically different scenario compared to Montana in terms of how the response should be. So I think the best way to think about it as a messenger in terms of communicating is, can you help explain the different variables that are out there and let people be better informed about the decisions that they can make? And so kind of playing on the last question, if I have to go on TV or I'm on social media, I'm always looking for analogies that I think can help the audience understand. I mean, aside from pointing everybody to the doctors, which are on this presentation, I'm going to do that first. And I'm going to point to institutions and that information, but can you give them an analogy or a metaphor that helps them understand a dynamic situation for them? So I oftentimes are on when there's violent incidents, the information is conflicting or not well known. And so I try and lay out a range of scenarios and then pick just 2 or 3 items that help me inform, that I'm looking for to help inform me about which of these scenarios is actually happening. I think that's a helpful way to help the public as well in terms of messaging is, here are some things that you should think about. And we've gotten better with it, I think, in terms of age categories and vulnerabilities and things like that. Just help the audience focus on 2 or 3 things to help them make a better decision that they feel more secure with and get some information that can be trusted.
Look how much better it's been with the information about the Omicron variant. I'm really impressed. It didn't take that long for the message to be clear and consistent. And I mean, it was really a model, I think, here recently, when public health officials said, we're going to need 2 weeks. We haven't, we don't have the data yet. We've still got to, do some things. We'll get back to you. Here's what we know so far. Here are the questions we're asking. And then today, it seemed like a couple of them were resolved. That was terrific.
Another question came up about non-peer-reviewed studies or preprints and the role that they have in public trust in science. And I'd love to hear from the academics and the non-academics about what the public should know, why these are a good thing in some contexts, but also how to understand the risks and caveats.
So preprints allow your scientific colleagues to weigh in, and it makes the final study better and get closer to the truth. So I mean, preprints are not a leak. They're trying to improve the product. I'm not sure there's much of a public market for preprints. I don't see a lot of the lay public out there, scouring the internet for the preprints on the next set of data on some scientific question, unless they're cherry picking. And if they're a denier, they are sure to find that one study which, and maybe they'll go back to the preprint, not the actual published study, which scrubbed out the hypothesis that didn't make it, but they'll go back and they'll quote you the preprint, which had the fact in it that wasn't really a fact that they wanted to use later. So, I mean, preprints are part of science because scientists need to revise what they think on the basis of new evidence, and it's part of it. But if not seen in the right way, I think they can be misleading.
Yeah, and I want to step back and say that preprints are pretty new in the field of science, and the reason they have become so predominant in this pandemic response is because of the lessons of prior epidemics.
Yeah.
In 2013, 2016 Ebola virus disease epidemic, the whole question was like, look, what I started with at the very beginning, if you have a new pathogen, you want to share information about it quickly because you want to make changes to clinical care. You want to, if you found something that you think others should be paying attention to, keeping their ear to the ground about, you want to be able to share that. And in the past, there weren't as many people were waiting. There was this, you should know this is some of the difficult parts of science, right? People wanted to publish their data because they wanted to get credit for it. And so there was a dragging of the feet before you can share the data. And so preprints were this ability to share data that was evolving, but then also for academics and scientists to say, look, this is the methodology that we did it with. This is how we sort of present it. But it's an unregulated space. It is not peer reviewed. And I actually think, and would love to get Clint's thoughts on this, one thing that, Lee was talking about how when you speak, it scares the heck out of him. It scares the heck out of me, the ability of where I see preprints going in the future. Because one example, so aside from the cherry picking and the science deniers, there seems to be an element of almost growing use by disinformation agents of preprints.
That's right.
Of taking conspiracy theories, turning them into preprints, uploading them into preprint servers, and then having it be amplified by media, by media agencies. And that's how they come to people's attention. It's when they really get picked up by well-meaning or not well-meaning, information and media agencies to try to share that information. That's when public sort of starts to pay attention. And that scares me because this is the space that we thought we had created to be able to communicate during outbreaks and to affect patient quality of care and things like that. And we do want to keep some of it. We may have to introduce like faster peer review before something goes on preprint servers. But the weaponization of preprint scares me.
So everything in my world is preprint, so because it's Twitter and social, Facebook. And so I always find it interesting. So there are other parallels that are less dangerous to preprints, which is economic forecast and like early returns for businesses and things like that, which are offset with a market. So we went through a period of this in the intelligence community after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and these sort of things. And what they did do, which I thought was smart, was they created a market where people evaluated it that were experts, meaning that an assessment comes out or a study comes out or satellite imagery or a bunch of votes, around something. So it was available, but it was to a closed community. And then there was essentially, I don't want to call it a betting market, but think of it as an expert market where they sort of discuss these things. And I noticed, I think Melanie in one of your comments talked about it's a good opportunity to communicate uncertainty. You will hear this all the time. It's called Bloomberg TV or CNBC, right? There'll be a return that will come in and you will have experts discuss it and then people trade on that market. That's an uncertainty market, right? So the problem with medical stuff is it's instantaneous and people are nervous about it and scared. And so they're making quick and rapid judgments. So I think there are some intricate ways where you could take, for example, in social media, or you could rely on experts. And I actually wrote about this for the Central Intelligence Agency about 10 years ago. It was called The Wisdom of Outliers, which is crowds are really good at understanding things that they've experienced personally or where they have knowledge and when they're decentralized and independent, not Twitter today. And so anything that they don't know about, they're not going to be particularly good at. Disinformation peddlers are priming information now. They're putting in fake VARS reports, right? They're making fake studies. They're finding people that aren't doctors to rate fake studies, because in the world of disinformation, it's false until you make it true. Meaning once you push, you still continue to push evidence to make your outcome appear that way. That's a perception battle. But I think the other thing to think about is, could we take all these doctors who are, amazing in this field, create some sort of discussion space that even the public could see to a degree, which would allow somebody like me, who's not an expert, right, to kind of have some bearings on it and amplify some perspective on it, or the media and their reporters, right? They're going to jump on anything about COVID right now. Omicron's a great example, right? You saw this turbulence go through the system, but could we structure a place where we can reduce the turbulence and also find better science, at the same time and work to that? Like they said, I don't think pre-pubs are going to go away because it's very difficult to put something back in once it's come out. But in terms of that phenomenon, could we create those dynamics that we see like in business markets where results will come out, but you have real experts that will come on and, well, there's different ways to think about this, or the results could turn out to be this, or we need more studies before we jump off a cliff. Maybe there's a way to do that. And in the business intelligence world, there's a lot of firms that make a lot of money kind of doing that for different clients. So maybe we can just do it for the public in some sort of way.
Great. We're out of time, but I would love to hear briefly a sentiment on an upbeat note from each of you about what brings you hope as we approach 2022 with regard to science, the dark chapter of the pandemic, and so on.
Yeah, I will go. Monterey commitment is first. So I think the one thing that gives me hope and that I've held on to actually for a few months is the fact that this uncertainty has uncovered a lot regarding inequities and bias and how we are treating, diagnosing, and communicating to structurally marginalized communities. Now, of course, there is also a bit of cynicism there. Hope is that we don't pull back on these resources and pull the spotlight back. But we have, spoken so much and done so much work in order to look at data and think about data for health equity and put the spotlight on that and center our conversations on what does the data look like. So thinking a little bit about what science looks like in terms of equity. There's been so much work funding research and conversations in the space. And so the hope is that that will also include continuing conversations about communication, including workforce development, so that we have more scientists, researchers, communicators, people in media who are among the most affected group to help influence the dialogue.
Yeah, I'll just say it's 2 years into this pandemic and we have vaccines that are safe. We've been able to find therapeutics and sometimes it may feel like we're back to square one every time you hear about a new variant or something else, or even the challenges like, getting vaccines to everybody around the world. It seems like a long uphill battle ahead of us. But look at what we accomplished. kicking and fighting, and yes, a lot of costs along the way. I don't know if you can still hear me. My AirPods are dying in my ear. But like, it's incredible how we came together as a global community, despite a lot of the things that we've talked about today, the challenges, the fast moving sort of scene, to be able to share that data. And that makes us stronger, I think, because we are in an age of epidemics. We've changed the environment around us. And so we're going to continue to see epidemic threats in the future. But also, what I hope it's done is help us identify new questions we need to answer, including the issue around equity, but also around disinformation, misinformation as new challenges that we scientists need to take into integration as we're thinking about pandemic preparedness.
Clint, I'll go next so you can go last if you
Yes.
like. So one thing that's made me optimistic recently is to realize that this may not sound like reason to be optimistic, but I think it is, that it's not really one problem, it's three. There's the creation of disinformation, there's the amplification of disinformation, and there's the uptake of disinformation. And we don't have to just work on the third side. We've spent so much time thinking about how to work on the third problem. And in a way, the folks who are believing lies, disinformation, are victims, and they deserve our empathy. And if we can figure out how to, not let the polarization see, skeptics, disbelievers, even when they're angry and, holding signs and, even threatening, to understand that they're being duped and that there's something that we can do about that, not just by talking to them, but by doing some of the things that Clint was talking about, working on deplatforming the disinformers, and making the algorithms of the social media companies more public, because I think that the opacity of those algorithms is part of what's made the situation worse. And if Congress does one thing to regulate social media, I think it should be to make the companies' algorithms more available to academic researchers so that we don't have to wait for a whistleblower to tell us what the harms are. I think that is the pinch point where we'll really be able to do something about this problem.
I'll go real quick, which is I think the younger generation behaves better in the information environment than the older one. And that's been a positive to learn. I've got to work with a really great team of young people over the last couple of years. They are super bright and smart. They come up with great ideas. It used to be your parents were the example for you, and it's kind of been interesting to watch how they've been the example for me. And I think a lot of the older generation that's not been so great in the information environment. So I'm pretty positive about a lot of these things. They've solved one of the most amazing stories I saw in the pandemic was a restaurant that was going under because they lost all their customers, and a kid made an app for his own dad and became like the hottest selling business. This is amazing, right? So I am very optimistic that many of the problems we're having right now in the information environment will improve because the younger generation has grown up on technology and they're pretty savvy about a lot of these things.
Thank you for all of those thoughts and for sharing your time, experience, and expertise with everyone today. On behalf of the Aspen Institute Science and Society Program and the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases and Policy and Research at Boston University, thank you so much for attending. We did record this. It'll be on YouTube either later today or tomorrow, and I'll send out the link to all the registrants. And this was the first collaborative event between CEID and the Aspen Institute Science and Society Program. So please be on the lookout for future programming from us. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.